The gate was closed. Catherine Dugan stood in front of it for the fourth time in as many days, her chest heaving with something she could not name, something that lived between fury and desperation, and a third feeling she absolutely refused to examine. The sun was hammering down on the high desert floor of the Cimarron Valley, New Mexico Territory, in the brutal summer of 1878, and the dust that had risen around her boots was settling back onto the cracked earth like it had given up. Like everything out here gave up eventually, she had not given up. That was the problem. She had left Lockhart's ranch that morning on the North Road, following the curve of the valley toward the trading post at Colfax, where she intended to sell two of her late father's horses and use the money to buy a stagecoach ticket east. Back to Kansas City. Back to something that resembled civilization. Back to a life that did not involve sleeping in a one-room adobe shack and waking up every morning to the specific particular torture of knowing that Abraham Lockhart was breathing on the other side of the valley. She had walked north for 2 hours. The road had bent. She had followed it. The sun had shifted. She had kept walking. And then the sage-covered hillside had opened up around her like a curtain pulled aside on a stage, and there it was, the gate. The same iron gate with the same L-shaped brand hammered into its center post. The same long fence line stretching east and west with the same cottonwood trees standing sentinel along the creek behind it. The same smoke rising from the same chimney on the main house at the top of the same ridge. She had not turned around. She had not taken a wrong road. She had walked deliberately and deliberately north, and the valley had delivered her here anyway, like it had opinions about where she belonged. You again. The voice came from behind her, and Catherine did not turn around for 3 full seconds because she needed those 3 seconds to arrange her face into something that did not betray the earthquake happening in her sternum. Abraham Lockhart was sitting on the top rail of the fence to the left of the gate, one leg dangling, one boot hooked on the lower rail, a piece of twisted grass between his teeth. He was looking at her the way a man looks at something he cannot figure out and has stopped pretending he has. His hat was pushed back on his head. There was a dark line of sweat at his collar. He looked completely, infuriatingly comfortable. "Mr. Lockhart," Catherine said. "Miss Dugan," he said back. They looked at each other across the distance between them, and Catherine felt the specific particular betrayal of her own body, the warmth that climbed up from somewhere below her ribs and tried to reach her face. She refused it. She had been refusing it for 3 weeks. "I am trying to leave this valley," she said, and she was mortified to hear how thin her voice sounded, how raw, like she had already been crying, which she had not. She absolutely had not. "And I keep ending up here." Abraham Lockhart took the piece of grass out of his mouth and looked at it like it had something interesting to say. "I know," he said. "You know. I've watched you go past this gate 4 times, Catherine." The use of her first name went through her like a current. He had used it once before, in a moment neither of them had discussed since, and the fact that he used it now, easily, like it was simply what he called her, felt like something she had not agreed to and desperately wanted. "Then you know it is not by choice," she said. "Is it not?" And there it was, the thing she had been dreading. The suggestion, quiet and entirely too perceptive, that maybe the valley was not the one bringing her back. That maybe she was. She was 31 miles from figuring that out yet, and she had no intention of crossing that distance today. She turned on her heel and walked back the way she had come. She was back at his gate by sundown. Catherine Dugan had arrived in the Cimarron Valley 23 days earlier in the kind of circumstances that happen to people who spend their lives trusting the wrong word given at the wrong time. Her father, Thomas Dugan, had written to her from his claim in New Mexico Territory every month for 2 years, describing a thriving homestead, a modest but solid house, a growing herd, and the beginnings of a real life in a real place. Catherine had been teaching school in Abilene, Kansas, living in a rented room above a dry goods store, and saving every dollar with the specific discipline of a woman who has learned that no one is coming to rescue her, that she must build the rescue herself. When her father's letters had stopped in April of 1878, she had waited 1 month. Then she had packed her trunk, settled her accounts, said goodbye to the 31 children in her classroom, and taken the Atchison, Topeka and Santa Fe Railway as far south as it went before switching to a mail coach that deposited her in Cimarron with $17, a trunk, and an address. The address led her to a falling-down claim shack with a caved-in roof, 2 horses in varying states of neglect in a leaning corral, and a neighbor named Old Pete Hargrove who told her, without any particular ceremony, that Thomas Dugan had died of a fever in March and had been buried on the ridge behind the shack by whoever happened to be nearby when it happened. He had not mentioned it in his letters because the last letter he had written was in March, just before he got sick, and he had died before he could write another one, and the mail in the Cimarron Valley moved at a pace that made the word delayed seem optimistic. Catherine had stood in the doorway of her father's ruined house for a long time. Then she had gone inside, assessed what was there, built a fire, cooked the only thing she had to cook, which was dried beans and some salt pork she had bought in town, and gone to sleep on a bedroll she found in the corner. She was not a woman who collapsed. She had not been permitted to be for most of her life. But the grief was there. It was enormous and patient, and it waited for her in the dark like something alive. She spent the first week making the shack livable, patching the roof with planks she found in the barn, clearing out what had rotted and salvaging what had not. Thomas Dugan had not been a wealthy man, but he had been methodical. There were tools. There was a supply of dried goods that had been protected from the elements in a sealed tin chest. There was a deed to 50 acres that the land office in Cimarron confirmed was legitimate, and there were those 2 horses, both of which responded to care with the gratitude of animals who had not received much of it. It was on the 8th day that she met Abraham Lockhart. She had been trying to clear the irrigation ditch that ran along the east edge of her property, a narrow channel that her father had apparently dug himself, and which had become blocked with debris and sediment during the months of his illness. The work was hard and muddy, and she had been at it for 3 hours in the already savage heat of a New Mexico June morning, and she had gotten the thing about half cleared when a shadow fell over her, and she looked up to find a man on horseback watching her from the edge of her property. He was not a small man. He sat his horse the way men do when they have spent more time in the saddle than out of it, easy and settled and without any of the performative stiffness that younger men affect. He was perhaps 35. She would later learn 36, with dark hair going gray at the temples and jaw, a face that was weathered in the honest way that comes from actual work rather than affectation, and eyes that were doing something she could not immediately categorize. They were not assessing. They were not dismissive. They were paying the kind of attention that made a person feel simultaneously seen and deeply uncertain what to do with that. "The blockage is another 20 feet north," he said. "There's a root ball from that dead cottonwood. You'll spend a week on the rest of this and never get the water moving until you pull that out." Catherine straightened and wiped her hands on the canvas apron she wore over her dress. "Thank you," she said, with the particular precision of a woman establishing immediately that she does not need assistance, just information. "Abraham Lockhart," he said, inclining his head. "Catherine Dugan," she said, "Thomas Dugan's daughter." Something moved across his face that she could not read. Not quite grief, not quite guilt, something in between. "I know," he said. "I was at the burial." She had not expected that. She felt the grief do something sudden and sharp in her chest, and she pressed it back down with the firm hand of long practice. "Thank you for that," she said, and she meant it, and the evenness in her voice cost her more than she would ever tell anyone. He looked at her for another moment, nodded once, and rode north along the fence line without another word. She watched him go and then went back to digging. The root ball was exactly where he had said it was. She spent the next 3 days thinking about him the way she thought about problems, which was to say constantly and methodically, and with the determined intention of reaching a conclusion. The conclusion she reached was that Abraham Lockhart was a rancher with significant holdings that bordered her father's claim on 3 sides, that he had been present at her father's death and burial, and had said nothing about it in either the land office or the town of Cimarron, where he clearly had influence, and that he looked at her with an expression she did not have a name for, which was a problem, because Catherine Dugan had a name for everything. She began to learn the valley. She walked its roads in the mornings before the heat became murderous, mapping the terrain with the systematic instinct of a woman who has always survived by understanding exactly where she was. The Cimarron Valley in the summer of 1878 was a place of severe beauty, red and amber cliffs rising from a floor of sage and juniper, the Cimarron River threading through it all with the kind of quiet persistence that rivers have, the sky above it the hard cobalt blue of a place that takes itself seriously. And the roads were strange. She noticed it first on her 3rd morning of walking. She had set out east, toward the road that led to Cimarron town, following a clear track she could see ahead of her for a 1/4 mile. The track bent around a limestone outcropping and she followed it, and the outcropping opened into a wider wash, and the wash connected to a broader road, and she followed that road north because it looked correct. It felt north. The sun was where the sun should be for east-going, north-leaning travel, and then the sage parted and there was the gate. She had stopped and stared at it. Then she had turned around and gone back the way she had come and found the east road without any trouble and reached Cimarron town in 40 minutes and spent the day in town without thinking about gates at all. The second time was 4 days later. She had gone south, toward the creek crossing where old Pete Hargrove had a small sheep operation and had offered to help her understand the grazing patterns of the valley. She made it halfway to Pete's crossing before the road bent in a way she did not expect, and the creek reappeared on the wrong side, and she climbed a low ridge to get her bearings, and from the top of the ridge she could see down into the next fold of the valley, and there was the gate. She descended the ridge on the far side, found a different road going south, and reached Pete's crossing without further incident. The 3rd time she had simply set out walking in a direction she chose at random, not north or south or east, but somewhere between southeast and whatever you called the direction that felt like a way. She had walked for an hour. The valley had curved her around and deposited her in front of the gate. She had stood there for 5 minutes, staring at it, and then Abraham Lockhart had come riding down from the main house with a canteen in his hand. "You look like you could use some water," he said. She looked at him. She looked at the gate. She looked at the surrounding countryside with the controlled fury of a woman trying to understand something irrational. "Are there particular tricks to the roads in this valley?" she asked. Something crossed his face that might have been amusement and might have been something considerably more complicated. "There are," he said. "Some of them loop, particularly on the west side of the valley. The terrain folds in ways that aren't obvious until you know them, and this gate is at the center of those folds. The ranch sits at the low point of a natural basin," he said. "Most roads in the area eventually feed through here, or near here." He held out the canteen. She took it, drank, and handed it back. "Thank you," she said. Then she walked home by the most deliberate route she could find, marking every landmark in her memory with the precision of a surveyor. She went back to the gate the next morning on purpose because she had decided that what she needed was to understand the thing that kept defeating her. You did not conquer a problem by avoiding it. You went toward it until you understood it, and then you decided what to do. Abraham Lockhart was coming out of the barn when she arrived. He stopped when he saw her. Then he walked to the gate and opened it. "Come in," he said, "or don't. But if you're going to stand on one side or the other for very long, you might as well come in for coffee." It was the most plainly spoken invitation she had ever received, and it was exactly the kind of thing that worked on her, plain and without performance. She went through the gate. His house was not what she had expected. It was large by valley standards, with a proper covered porch running its full length, 2 glazed windows facing south, and inside, shelves of books. Not a few books, not the 2 or 3 volumes that men kept as decoration. Shelves. She counted later and arrived at somewhere between 60 and 70 volumes, covering everything from stock breeding manuals to history to what appeared to be a complete set of Shakespeare. She stood in front of those shelves for a long moment while he built up the fire for coffee, and she heard him say quietly from the other side of the room, "Go ahead and look." She pulled out a volume. It was a history of the Comanche Nation written in 1866, annotated in pencil in a hand she assumed was his, dense and careful notes in the margins about land use patterns and seasonal movements, and a recurring word she kept seeing that was simply wrong. The word was unjust. Written and rewritten throughout, with the careful insistence of a man who believed in naming things accurately. She put it back. She sat down at the table and accepted the coffee, and they talked for 2 hours about things that had nothing to do with her being at his gate. They talked about the valley, about the Maxwell land grant dispute that had been splitting the region for years, about the range wars she could feel building in the territory like weather. They talked about Thomas Dugan, carefully, the way you talk about someone both people are still feeling their way around grieving. Abraham told her that her father had been a decent and stubborn man who had run his fence line exactly right and kept his word on every arrangement they had ever made. He said it simply, without embellishment, and Catherine felt the grief move in her chest, and this time she let it move because she was not being watched by children or land agents or anyone who needed her to be steady. She was just being watched by Abraham Lockhart, and something in his expression made that feel impossibly safe. She went home before noon. She thought about him all afternoon. She thought about him in the specific way that is actually thinking about yourself, about the person you are when someone is paying real attention to you, about the version of Catherine Dugan that had sat across that table and talked without measuring every word first. She had not done that in a very long time. She spent the following week in deliberate productivity. She completed the roof repair. She negotiated with Pete Hargrove about shared water rights on the creek. She rode into Cimarron and registered her father's deed in her own name with a land agent who did not look entirely happy about it, which she noted and filed away as a potential problem. She began drafting a letter to the county seat about the state of the roads in the valley, which was how she thought about what was happening, as a problem with roads, not as a compulsion she did not fully understand. She met Abraham again at the Cimarron trading post, where they were both buying supplies, and the conversation they had in the dusty main room of that establishment, beside the counter of cotton goods and leather goods and tins of coffee and sugar, was the most natural conversation she had had in recent memory, easy and quick, and moving through 6 subjects in 10 minutes the way good conversation does when both people are genuinely interested. He helped her carry her purchases to where she had tied her horse. He stood in the dusty street and looked at her. "I want to say something," he said, "and I'd like you to hear it before you decide what to think about it." She waited. "I'm glad you're staying," he said. "I didn't know if you would after you saw the state of the place. I thought you might turn around and go east." "I considered it," she said honestly. "What made you stay?" She looked at him for a moment and decided on the truth, which was always her instinct when she had time to choose. "The deed is mine," she said, "and nothing that belongs to me gets abandoned without a fight." He looked at her for a long time after that, and the expression on his face was the same one she had been trying to name since the first morning he rode along her fence line, and she still could not find the word for it, but it felt, she thought, like recognition. Like he had seen something he had been looking for without knowing he was looking. She rode home before she could think about that too deeply. Then came the day she found the letter. She had been cleaning the corner of the shack that served as her father's desk, a rough plank table with a single drawer that she had not yet opened because she had been saving it, in the illogical way of grief, for when she was ready. She opened it on a Tuesday morning when the sky was doing something extraordinary with the light, all gold and high and clean, and inside the drawer was a collection of papers that included claim records and a tally of his horses and a letter written in her father's hand and addressed to Abraham Lockhart. She did not read other people's correspondence. She had very clear principles about this. She read it. It was dated the 1st of March, which was, she calculated, perhaps 2 weeks before her father died. It was 3 pages long. It described his illness, which he was clearly aware of even then, in a matter-of-fact way that tore at her heart. It described his finances, which were more precarious than his letters to her had suggested. The homestead was viable but barely, and there was a specific debt mentioned, a loan from a man named Dale Ferris, the same land agent she had registered her deed with, that her father had taken 2 years earlier and had been struggling to repay. It described the horses and gave instructions about their care. And then, in the last half page, it described Catherine. He told Abraham that she was coming. He said he had not told her about the debt because she would come sooner and give him money. She had earned herself by genuine labor, and he could not permit that. He said she was the finest person he had ever known and more stubborn than a creek going uphill, which he appeared to mean as a compliment. He asked Abraham, in the plain language of a man without pretension, to keep an eye on her. Not in a way that removes her independence, her father had written. She will not tolerate that, and she should not have to. Just keep an eye. Make sure she knows there is a neighbor she can trust. She has not always had that. The letter was never sent. It was in the drawer. Which meant it had been there when Abraham came to the house after the burial, which he had been. Pete Hargrove had told her because it was Abraham who had organized the men and the minister and the plot on the ridge. He had been inside the house, and the letter was still in the drawer. He had not read it either. She sat with that for a long time. Then she thought about the debt. Dale Ferris, the land agent who had registered her deed with an expression of barely concealed displeasure. She thought about the size of that displeasure and now understood its shape. If her father had died without a legal heir to claim the property, the land would have been available, and Ferris, as the holder of the debt, would have had claims on it. Catherine's appearance had interrupted something. She was not certain exactly what, but she understood enough about the way land worked in 1878 New Mexico to know that interrupted plans became dangerous plans when money was involved. She needed to understand the debt. She needed to understand the full terms and what it meant for the claim she now held. And she needed to think carefully about whether Dale Ferris was the kind of man who simply accepted disappointment, or the kind who decided to create a different outcome. She rode to Abraham's gate. She knocked this time on the gate post, which was ridiculous, but she did it anyway. He came out of the house and down the path without hurrying and opened the gate. "I found a letter my father wrote you," she said without preamble, because she had made a decision on the ride over, and the decision was to tell the truth. "It was in his desk. He never sent it." Abraham went still. "I read it," she continued. "I read it because I thought it might be important, and I was right. It contains information about a debt he owed to Dale Ferris." She watched his face while she said this, watching for the thing she was afraid of, which was that he already knew. That whatever her father had written in that letter had reached him by some other channel, and he had been keeping it from her, maneuvering her, playing the careful neighbor for hidden reasons. What she saw instead was a complex and immediate emotion that she read as having nothing to do with calculation and everything to do with something being settled in him, some decision or question that had been waiting. "Come inside," he said. She went inside. They sat at the same table. He poured coffee without asking, the way people do when they have done it before and know how it goes. "I know about Ferris," he said. "Not the amount, not the terms. But I know he had his eye on your father's claim for the past year and a half. I tried to warn Thomas last fall. He paused, looking for the word. He was proud. He didn't want to hear that he had gotten himself into something he couldn't get out of alone. He didn't want to hear it from a neighbor who could have bought the debt and the claim both without feeling it," Catherine said, not unkindly, because she understood pride, had spent her whole life navigating it. Abraham met her eyes. "That's right. Do you know what Ferris intends to do now? I've heard things in town," he said. "He has a partner. Man named Cavell comes through the territory twice a year on what he calls business, but is actually land acquisition by way of pressure. They look for isolated claims, widow, people with insufficient legal support, make the debt terms suddenly uncomfortable, and the claim either gets sold under duress or simply abandoned. "I am not a widow," Catherine said. "No," he said, and there was something in his voice. "I am also not going to abandon anything." "No," he said again, and there was that expression, the one she could not name. "What I need to know," she said carefully, "is the actual legal state of the debt. Whether my father's death transferred it to me as heir, what the repayment schedule is, and whether Ferris has done anything irregular in how he has held it. Because if he has, there are remedies." Abraham looked at her with something that was absolutely not patronizing, which was the specific thing she was alert to in these conversations, and said, "There's a lawyer in Cimarron who's honest. Frank Mendez. He's handled the Maxwell land grant cases, and he knows property law in this territory as well as anyone. I can introduce you, or I can stay out of it entirely, whichever you prefer. The introduction would be useful," she said. "The rest is mine." "I know," he said. She looked at him across the table. The morning light was coming through the south-facing windows and doing the thing it did in that room, catching the dust in the air and making it luminous, and the books were on their shelves and the coffee was in her hands, and Abraham Lockhart was looking at her with complete and entire attention. "My father asked you to look out for me," she said. "He did, in the letter you read. But you hadn't read it." "No, but I've been doing it anyway." He said this with the simple directness of a man who has considered the alternatives and settled on honesty. "Not because you need looking after. You've been clear about what you are and what you can do, and both are formidable. But because this valley has its dangers and you were new to it, and Thomas Dugan was a man I respected, and you were clearly a woman I was going to." He stopped. She waited. "A woman I was going to have strong feelings about," he finished, and the restraint in that phrasing was, she thought, one of the most careful things she had heard a man say. Not a declaration, not a performance. An honest, contained, accurate description of an ongoing condition. She looked at her coffee cup, then she looked at him. "I need to focus on the matter with Ferris," she said. "Absolutely," he said. "After which we may have a different conversation." "Whenever you're ready," he said, and there was something in that, in the patience of it, that was almost unbearable. She finished her coffee and rode to Frank Mendez's office in Cimarron. Frank Mendez was a compact man in his 40s with careful hands and a desk that would have terrified a lesser person, being stacked with papers in a system only he could navigate. He was the son of a New Mexican family that had been in the territory since before it was American territory, and he had the specific, particular knowledge of someone who had watched land change hands by every means available, legal and otherwise, for his entire adult life. He listened to Catherine describe the situation with the focused attention of a man who has heard many versions of this story and can already see its shape. "The debt transfers to the heir," he said, "but only the debt. What does not automatically transfer is any claim Ferris might make on the property beyond standard debt recovery. If he tries to use the debt to assert ownership of the land itself, that requires a court order, and court orders require evidence. And if those debt terms were drawn without proper legal form, they may not hold. Can you find out? I can do better than that. I can request a full accounting from Ferris under territorial law. He is required to provide one within 30 days. If there is anything irregular in the terms or his handling of the debt, it will appear in the accounting." He looked at her. "This will make him nervous." "Good," she said. "It may also make him act quickly," Mendez added. "Men like Ferris, when they feel a scheme slipping, sometimes try to accelerate it. I want you to be careful." She thought about what Abraham had said about Cavell, the partner who came through twice a year. "When is Cavell due in the territory?" she asked. Mendez looked at her with a slight reassessment. "You've done some reading." "I've been talking to people," she said. "Cavell typically comes through in July," he said. "Which is in 3 weeks. Then we have 3 weeks to make this uncomfortable for them before they have a third party involved." Mendez smiled slowly, with the appreciation of a man who has spent a long career dealing with people far less prepared than the one currently sitting across from him. "I'll send the letter to Ferris today," he said. She rode home in the golden afternoon, and the road curved the way it always did in the western part of the valley, and she found herself at Abraham's gate, and this time she understood that she had simply chosen to come this way. She stopped at the gate. He was on the porch, reading. He looked up. "Mendez is sending a letter to Ferris today," she called. He closed the book. "How did that go?" "Exactly as it should," she said, and she was smiling, which surprised her, the physical reality of it on her face. He smiled back, and it changed his face completely. The severity of it broke open into something warm and slightly rueful and entirely real. She went home. She lay awake that night for a very long time, thinking about that smile. Over the following 2 weeks, things moved with the particular speed of events that have been building longer than anyone knew. The letter reached Ferris on a Thursday. By Saturday, there were rumors in town that he had been seen having a heated conversation at the saloon with a man no one had seen before, which Pete Hargrove, who noticed everything, reported to Catherine with the casual efficiency of a man who considers information a kind of currency between neighbors. Catherine went to Mendez's office the following Monday. Ferris had responded to the accounting request with a letter that was, Mendez said with controlled satisfaction, full of irregularities. The interest rate he had charged Thomas Dugan exceeded the territorial limit by nearly half. The repayment terms had been modified twice without documented agreement. And the clause he had apparently been planning to use to assert a land claim was written in language so legally murky that any competent judge in the territory would have struck it immediately. "We have grounds to contest the entire debt on the basis of the usurious interest," Mendez said. "If we file a challenge with the district court, the debt is stayed pending the ruling. Ferris cannot make any claim on the property until the court decides." "File it," Catherine said. "It will also mean he knows the full situation." "He already knows enough to be worried," she said. "I would rather have the protection of a court filing than the illusion of a secret." Mendez filed the challenge on a Wednesday. On Thursday, Dale Ferris came to her claim. He came in the mid-afternoon, in a buggy that was too fine for the valley roads, with a man beside him who had the specific kind of stillness that meant he was not there for conversation. Catherine had seen men like that in Abilene, men who were hired for their willingness to be the thing the other man didn't want to be himself. She was on the porch when they arrived, and she did not move from her chair. Ferris was a man of perhaps 50, broad through the shoulders, with a face that had once been handsome and now wore its years with the particular ugliness of a man who has spent them poorly. Got down from the buggy and came to the fence line, stopping there, not opening the gate. "Miss Dugan," he said, "I'd like to talk to you about your property." "My attorney has communicated what there is to communicate," she said. "If you have something to say in response, you may say it to Mr. Mendez." "I'd rather talk to you directly," he said. "This is a simple matter. The debt is owed. The claim is your collateral. I'd like to make you an offer for the land that clears the debt and leaves you with something." "The debt is under legal challenge," she said. "I am not going to discuss selling anything." Ferris's face did something complicated. "The challenge will take months," he said. "You'll spend more in legal fees than the debt is worth. I'm offering you a clean solution." "I'm not looking for your solution," Catherine said. "I am looking for just one." The man beside Ferris shifted slightly. Not a threat, not exactly, but a reminder that he was there. "I would ask you both to leave my property," Catherine said, with the measured precision of someone who is frightened and absolutely refusing to show it. Ferris looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, in a lower register that was meant to be heard as warning, "Women alone in this valley find it harder than they expect." "I am not alone in this valley," Catherine said. She had not planned to say it, and as soon as she did she understood that it was completely and precisely true. Ferris got back in his buggy. They left. Catherine waited until the sound of the wheels had completely faded, and then she allowed herself to breathe deeply, with the full acknowledgement of how frightened she had been. Then she saddled her horse and rode to Abraham's gate. He was already coming down the path when she arrived, which meant someone had seen the buggy at her place, which meant the network of attention in this valley was operating the way it operated, quietly and efficiently and in her favor. She was grateful for that in a way she had not expected to be. She told him what had happened. She told him about Ferris's implied threat. She told him she was not asking for intervention, that the legal approach was the right one and she believed in it, but that she wanted him to know. Abraham listened to everything without interrupting, which was a quality she had begun to understand was particular to him and not as common as it should be in human beings. When she finished, he said, "What do you need from me?" It was the right question. Not what he could do, what he could fix, what he would handle. What did she need? Just for someone to know, she said, in case things get complicated. "I'll know," he said, "and I'll be paying attention." They stood on opposite sides of his gate, and the late afternoon was putting its colors into the sky, the amber and the rose and the particular deep blue that came before the dark. And Catherine thought that she had been paying attention to Abraham Lockhart for nearly 3 weeks now, and what she had learned was this: that he was a man who meant exactly what he said, nothing more and nothing less, and that this was rarer than gold in 1878 New Mexico territory or anywhere else she had ever been. "Come through the gate," he said quietly. "Have supper. Go home after dark. I'll ride partway with you." She came through the gate. Supper was beans and cornbread and a piece of salt pork, made without ceremony on an iron stove by a man who clearly cooked for himself and had made peace with the simplicity of it. The kitchen was as clean as the library was full, and she set the table because it wanted setting, and he did not tell her she didn't need to, just handed her the plates without comment. They talked through supper about things that had nothing to do with Ferris, about his childhood in Texas, his father's cattle operation, the way he had come north into New Mexico territory 8 years ago and found the Cimarron Valley and understood immediately that it was where he intended to stay. He talked about the land grant dispute with an anger she recognized as moral rather than personal, the injustice of it, families who had held land for generations suddenly vulnerable to men with papers from a distant government and the willingness to use them. He said the word unjust, the same word she had seen in the margins of that history book, and she understood that it was one of his foundational words. She told him about Abilene, about the school, about the 31 children, and the specific and daily miracle of watching a child understand something that had been dark to them before, the moment the light came on. She told him about her mother who had died when Catherine was 12, and about the years after that, the moving from relative to relative with her father who was not equipped by nature for stability but had loved her fiercely and inconsistently in the way some people love. "He told me in a letter once that you were the finest person he had ever known," Abraham said. She looked at him across the table. "The letter in the drawer." "No," he said. "He said it to me directly." Standing at this fence in October of last year. He'd had a difficult week and he was talking about what kept him going, and he said his daughter in Kansas was the answer to that question. She looked at her plate. "He was very proud of you," Abraham said. "He talked about your teaching. He said you'd given up a better situation to teach children who otherwise wouldn't have had anyone." "Abilene wasn't a better situation," she said. "It was a more comfortable one. Those are different things." He looked at her with the expression she had finally found a name for, sitting at this table in his kitchen with the lamp lit against the growing dark outside. The name was tenderness. It was tenderness without softness, without condescension, without any of the qualities that made tenderness from men something a woman had to be careful about. It was simply regard, clear and warm and completely honest. "What made you come to the valley instead of selling the claim and staying in Kansas?" he asked. She thought about it honestly. "I wanted to see where he lived," she said. "I wanted to stand where he stood. I thought I might understand him better if I did." She paused. "And I needed something to fight for. I have been fighting for other people's children for 4 years and I wanted something of my own." "Has it been what you expected?" She looked around the kitchen, then back at him. "Entirely not," she said. "And considerably better." He smiled, and there was that change in his face again. She rode home in the dark with him, riding 10 feet behind her, easy and unhurried. And at the fork in the valley road, he said good night and turned back. And she made the rest of the journey alone, with the stars enormous overhead, and the feeling in her chest enormous too, large and warm and frightening, and something she was no longer certain she wanted to resist. The weeks that followed were the most interesting of Catherine Dugan's adult life. The court process moved with the grinding patience of territorial law, but Mendez was strategic and persistent, and the challenge to Farris's debt terms was solid. What they discovered in the documentation that Farris was eventually compelled to provide was even better than they had hoped. The original loan document bore a date that conflicted with another transaction record by 3 months, suggesting that the terms had been backdated, which was not just irregular but fraudulent. Mendez filed a supplemental complaint with the district court that included this evidence. The debt, he told Catherine with restrained satisfaction, was likely to be voided entirely. Farris's response was to leave the territory. He did not do so dramatically. He simply was not in his office one morning, and a week later someone received a letter from him postmarked Santa Fe, and that was the end of Dale Farris in the Cimarron Valley. Cavell, when he came through in July, received word of the legal situation from sources Catherine would never fully identify, and moved on to different territory without stopping. The claim was hers, free and clear, with a fraudulent debt voided by a territorial court, and a deed registered in her name without further obstruction. She stood on the porch of her father's shack the day Mendez sent the final confirmation letter, and looked out at the 50 acres and the 2 horses in the corral, and the cleaned-out irrigation ditch that was running water again, and the ridge where her father was buried with its simple wooden marker, and she felt something settle in her that had been tilted for a very long time. Then she thought about what came next. What came next, she had known for some time, was a conversation. She had told Abraham that after the matter with Farris was resolved, they might have a different kind of conversation, and she was a woman who kept her word, including the words she said to herself. She rode to his gate. He was where she had come to think of as his place, on the fence rail, one leg dangling, a piece of grass between his teeth, hat pushed back. She had the distinct sense, not paranoid but simply accurate, that he had been watching for her. This did not disturb her the way it once might have. It felt instead like something exactly right. "The claim is mine," she said, "free and clear. Farris is gone and the debt is voided." He did not look surprised. He had been following the process through Mendez with her permission, staying current but not intervening. "Congratulations," he said, and he meant it completely. "Thank you," she said, "for the introduction to Mendez, for the information about Farris, for paying attention." "Always," he said. She looked at him for a moment. The valley was deep green and gold in the July heat, and the mountains were blue at the horizon, and the air smelled of sage and warm rock and the faint sweetness of the cottonwoods along the creek. "I would like to continue having supper at your table," she said, "if you're willing." He looked at her steadily. "Only supper, to start," she said. He got down from the fence rail and opened the gate. They started with supper, and moved through everything else with the deliberate patience of 2 people who have both been careful their entire lives and have learned, independently, that carefulness is not the same thing as fear. They moved through long evenings on the porch watching the stars appear over the valley, through Sunday afternoons when she brought her books, and he brought his, and they read in the same room without speaking for hours, and this was not silence so much as it was the most comfortable kind of company. Through mornings when she came to help with the fence repair, he was undertaking on the east pasture, and found that working alongside someone with genuine competence was a different thing entirely from working alone, not lesser, just different and richer. He came to her claim too. He helped her assess the south pasture, which her father had apparently intended to use for hay production, and which still had the infrastructure, if not the cultivation. He brought her seeds from his own kitchen garden without fanfare, setting them on her table and leaving without making a ceremony of it. He read her father's agricultural notes, which she found in a second drawer she had not opened until July, and identified which of Thomas Dugan's plans were viable and which would not survive the soil conditions of her particular 50 acres, and he told her which was which with the honest directness that was simply his way of being. She kissed him the first time on an evening in late July, when the thunderstorm that had been building over the mountains all day finally broke over the valley, and they were both on her porch watching it come in, the lightning tracking down from the clouds in the south, and the thunder rolling through the ridges like a conversation between things much larger than people. The rain hit all at once, a wall of it, and they were both instantly soaked despite the porch overhang, and he was laughing, actually laughing, full and unguarded, and she turned and looked at him and kissed him because the laugh had finally done what the tenderness and the steadiness and the books and the plain-spoken honesty had been doing for weeks, which was to make her completely certain. He kissed her back with the same quality she had come to know in him, full attention and no performance, and when they broke apart the rain was still coming down, and the thunder was still rolling through the mountains, and Catherine Dugan felt, for the first time in longer than she could honestly remember, that she was exactly where she was supposed to be. "I should tell you something," he said after a moment. She waited. "When Thomas first told me about you, about his daughter in Kansas, I thought he was doing what fathers do, making someone sound better than they are because he loved them. I prepared myself to meet someone ordinary." She raised an eyebrow. "And the first morning I watched you dig that irrigation ditch," he said, "I understood that ordinary was not going to be the word I needed." She looked at him in the rain-cooled evening air and felt the warmth of it, of being seen accurately and without myth. "I am not extraordinary," she said. "I am simply very determined." "In this valley," he said, with a slight smile, "determined is extraordinary." They stood on the porch until the rain passed, and the mountains turned clear and sharp the way they do after storms, every ridge and peak defined as if newly made, and the valley below them steamed gently in the returning warmth. And Catherine thought that she had come here expecting to grieve a father and fight a fraudulent debt and perhaps rebuild a failing homestead, and instead she had found this specific valley and this specific man, and this specific version of herself, that had apparently been waiting here for her to arrive. She had kept coming back to his gate because the valley curved that way, because the roads folded around the natural basin where his ranch sat, because the geography of the place was what it was, and she had not been able to help it. She had also kept coming back because she had not wanted to help it. These two things, she decided that evening, were not contradictory. They were the same thing. Summer deepened, and the days took on a shape that Catherine recognized as the shape of a life, actually being lived rather than managed. She worked her 50 acres with a practical vision that her father would have recognized and perhaps exceeded. She got the south pasture cleared and planted with winter wheat, a reasonable gamble in this soil and climate that Mendez, who farmed on the side, confirmed was sound. She worked out an arrangement with Pete Hargrove for shared grazing during the dry months, a fair deal on both sides that Pete seemed genuinely pleased with, and she began a conversation with the county seat about the road conditions in the valley, which led to a formal survey being commissioned, which led to the discovery that two of the western roads had never been properly mapped, and their peculiar looping tendency was the result of a surveying error made a decade earlier. She told Abraham about this, the surveying error, and they both laughed about it in the way you laugh when you understand that the thing that felt like fate was actually just incompetent surveying, and somehow that made it better rather than worse. He asked her to marry him in September, on a morning when the valley was beginning its first turn toward autumn and the cottonwoods along the creek were going gold, standing at the gate because she had arrived at the gate, and he had come to meet her, and neither of them had moved inside yet. just stood there in the morning with the light doing what September light does in New Mexico, heavy and amber, and full of something that feels like endings becoming beginnings. He asked her plainly and directly, the way he did everything without a speech or a prepared phrase, just, "I want to marry you, Catherine. I want to build something with you on this land. I want to be the person who knows where you are every day and who you come home to. Tell me what you think about that." She thought about it, not for long, but actually because she respected both of them too much to say yes without thinking about it genuinely. "I want to keep my claim," she said. "I will not fold it into your holdings. It is mine and it stays mine." "Obviously," he said, "and I will continue to make my own decisions about how it is managed." "I would be disappointed if you didn't," he said. "And I want to continue teaching, if there is a way to establish a school in this valley, because I am not able to simply stop being a person who teaches." "The ranch house has a room that could be a schoolroom," he said. "I have been thinking about it since you mentioned the children in Abilene." She looked at him for a long moment in the September morning. "Yes," she said. "Those are my terms and my answer is yes." He smiled, the smile that broke his face open and made him entirely different and entirely himself. And he opened the gate, and she came through it. And he took her hands the way you take something you have been careful with for a very long time, holding it finally with the sureness that comes from knowing it is not going anywhere. They were married in October by the minister in Cimarron, in a small ceremony attended by Frank Mendez and his wife, Pete Hargrove and his grown daughter, 3 neighboring ranching families that Abraham had known for years, and a collection of the valley's children who came because children always know when something worth witnessing is happening. Catherine wore a dress she had made herself from dark blue wool, which was practical for the October weather, and which she had trimmed with cream ribbon that she had purchased at the trading post, with the particular pleasure of buying something beautiful for a specific and joyful reason. Abraham wore his best coat and the expression of a man who has gotten what he wanted, and is not certain he deserves it, and has decided to be grateful rather than argue the point. Frank Mendez gave a toast at the dinner Pete Hargrove's daughter organized that evening in the Trading Post's back room, and the toast was about the valley and its peculiar roads, and how even the most determined traveler eventually arrived where she was going. And he said it with the warmth of a man who had watched Catherine fight for her claim, and who understood, in the way lawyers sometimes do, what a person is made of when you see them tested. The room cheered. Abraham looked at Catherine across the table, and the expression was the one she had named in his kitchen on a summer evening: tenderness, clear and warm and entirely honest. She reached across the table and took his hand. The autumn was the most beautiful she had ever seen, and she had been paying attention to autumns her whole life. The cottonwoods went the specific blazing gold of a New Mexico October, and the sage was pewter silver against it, and the cliffs above the valley caught the late light in a way that made them look like they were lit from within. She rode her own land and Abraham's land and the borderland between them, which was no longer a border so much as a territory they both inhabited, and she felt the valley with the deep proprietary joy of someone who has earned a place. She moved into the ranch house, keeping the claim shack maintained and her livestock on her own 50 acres, riding over to check on them every other day with the satisfaction of a woman who owns something and knows it. She set up the spare room as a schoolroom, as Abraham had suggested, with a proper board bought from the lumber yard in Cimarron and benches made by a local carpenter, and a set of McGuffey readers ordered from Santa Fe. She sent word through the valley that a school was opening after the new year. By January of 1879, she had 14 children. By April, she had 22. The schoolroom required an addition, which Abraham built over 2 weekends in March with the help of 3 neighboring men and their sons, raising the walls with the practical cooperation that characterized ranch communities when they chose to cooperate, which was reliable when the purpose was clear and good. Catherine taught reading and arithmetic and geography and history. She taught the children of ranchers and the children of homesteaders, and when their parents allowed it, the children of the Mexican families who had been in the valley since before the territory changed hands, and the children of a Jicarilla Apache family who had settled near the river after the reservation boundaries had been redrawn in ways that displaced them from land they had lived on for generations. She taught all of them together, which some people in the valley found controversial and which she dealt with by being entirely clear that the school was open to every child in the valley, and if a parent had an objection, they were welcome to discuss it with her. And then she was so obviously and entirely correct about the matter that the objections, in most cases, found somewhere else to be. Abraham supported this without reservation. He had his own history with questions of land and justice in the territory. The Maxwell land grant dispossession had touched families he knew, and the Jicarilla displacement was something he had opinions about that were consistent with the word unjust and its appearances in the margins of his books. They fought sometimes, genuinely and with conviction, about how to handle a particular problem with the shared grazing arrangement, about a decision Catherine made regarding the school curriculum that he thought impractical and she thought necessary, and they were both partially right. They fought like two people who respected each other's intelligence and expected to be disagreed with honestly, and who found their way through disagreement by talking rather than by one of them retreating. It was not always easy, and it was never boring, and it was, Catherine thought, what a marriage between two real people actually looked like. He came to her one evening in the spring of 1879 with the expression of someone who has been thinking carefully about whether to say something and has decided to say it. "I want to tell you something about when your father was sick," he said. "I want you to know why I didn't come and get you." She set down the mending she was working on. She had wondered about this in quiet moments, had put it away, given him the good faith of waiting. Now she looked at him and listened. "He asked me not to," Abraham said. "Specifically, the morning I understood how sick he was, I told him I could get word to you and have you here in 10 days, and he said no. He said he didn't want you to come to a deathbed, he wanted you to come to a life. He said when he was gone the claim would be yours and you would come of your own power and on your own terms, and that was how he wanted it." Catherine sat with this. "I disagreed with him," Abraham said. "I told him so. He was stubborn, as you know, and he said it was his death and he had the right to decide who attended it." She looked at the window, at the dark spring evening outside, at the lamplit reflection of the room. "He was right," she said finally, "and wrong, but more right than wrong." "I think so too," Abraham said, "but I wanted you to know that I argued." "Thank you for telling me," she said. She went to the ridge the following Sunday morning and stood at her father's grave for a long time in the quiet that exists at altitude in early spring, the birds beginning their business in the scrub below, and the mountains still white at their tops, and the valley spread out in its particular grandeur below her. She talked to him, internally, the way you talk to the dead, which is really talking to the version of them you carry inside yourself, and which is, in that sense, entirely real. She told him about the claim and the school and Abraham, the marriage and the October ceremony, and the particular look on Abraham Lockhart's face when he said something he meant. She told him she thought he had made a good neighbor. She thought she heard him, in the way of wind moving through juniper, say that he had thought so too. She was pregnant by June of 1879, which she understood first from her body, and confirmed with the help of the valley's midwife, a Tejana woman named Dolores Reyes, who had been delivering babies in the Cimarron Valley for 20 years and whose authority on the matter was absolute. She told Abraham on a Tuesday evening after supper, directly, without preparation, because the thing about Abraham Lockhart was that you did not need to prepare him for facts. His face did something she had never seen it do, something that started below the surface and worked its way up slowly, comprehending and then certain, and then open in a way that his face was not usually open, the careful reserve he carried simply not there anymore, replaced by something completely unguarded. He stood up from the table and came around to where she was sitting and crouched down to be level with her and took her face in his hands, gently, the way you hold something you cannot believe is real, and did not say anything for a moment. Then he said, "Catherine," just her name. But in his voice it was not a word, it was everything. She put her hands over his. "It will change things," she said. "Everything worth having does," he said. She smiled and felt the warmth that she had stopped trying to contain or control or name, because she had learned over the last year that it was simply what it felt like to love someone fully and know they loved you back. The pregnancy was hard in the late months. The summer heat of 1880 was brutal even by New Mexico standards, and Dolores came often and was pragmatic and kind in equal measure, and told Catherine things that were true and useful rather than reassuring, which Catherine preferred. Abraham was present in the way he was present in everything, fully and without drama, adapting whatever needed adapting without being asked, finding solutions to practical problems without ceremony. He also read to her in the evenings, from the books on his shelves, sometimes history, sometimes the Shakespeare she had found herself increasingly interested in, sometimes the stock breeding manuals that she had developed an unexpected fondness for because they were full of the same kind of detailed observation she brought to teaching. Their son was born in early October of 1880 in the ranch house, with Dolores presiding and Abraham nearby in the way Dolores permitted, which was near enough to be present and far enough to be useful. He came into the world in the early morning when the sky was beginning its shift toward dawn, and the valley was the quiet dark blue of not quite day. They named him Thomas for her father, and the middle name was Daniel for Abraham's grandfather, and the two names sat together in a way that felt, Catherine thought, like the conjunction of two different kinds of determination. Thomas Lockhart was, from the beginning, a child of strong opinions and enormous curiosity, and a physical energy that had her reconsidering certain aspects of the schoolroom setup before he was old enough to attend. He had Abraham's eyes and Catherine's stubbornness, which Abraham observed with the pleased recognition of a man who finds the combination both challenging and entirely appropriate. The school grew. By 1881 she had 30 children and had trained a young woman named Rosa Hargrove, Pete's daughter, as an assistant teacher, which freed Catherine to continue her own work while ensuring the children were continuously taught. Rosa was gifted with the younger children and took to it with the natural authority of someone who has found the thing they are meant to do. The valley changed in the years that followed, as valleys in the New Mexico territory changed in the early 1880s, with the railroad coming closer, and the land disputes settling slowly through legal processes that were imperfect but directional, and the communities finding their various ways of coexisting, sometimes well and sometimes badly, and usually somewhere in between. Catherine was involved in several of the legal matters that touched families she knew, not as a lawyer, but as someone who had navigated the system herself and understood what it required, who to see and what paperwork meant, and how to find a Frank Mendez in whatever town the court process ran through. Abraham ranched with the competence and the ethical stubbornness that characterized him, maintaining his land with care and paying his workers wages that were, by the standards of the territory, fair. A standard he defended in conversations at the trading post with the same plain directness he brought to everything. He expanded the herd carefully, not recklessly, because he understood the land and what it could carry and did not ask more from it than it could give. They were happy. Not in the uncomplicated way that people sometimes imagine happiness, as an absence of difficulty, but in the actual way of it, which is difficulty met together and overcome together and sometimes just endured together, and the warmth that this creates between two people who have decided to be honest with each other about everything, including the hard things. Catherine was pregnant again in the spring of 1882, which she had thought about and wanted, and told Abraham about in the same plain way she had told him the first time. He had the same open, unguarded face, and he added this time a laugh, the real one, the full unguarded one she had first seen in a rainstorm on her porch, and he said, "Thomas is going to be a handful about this." Thomas was, in fact, somewhat of a handful about it, for approximately 3 weeks, and then became the fiercest guardian of his infant sister, who was born in October of 1882 and named Margaret, for Catherine's mother, with the middle name Elena, for Dolor's Rays, who had been so present in both births that the debt of naming seemed appropriate, and who was visibly moved by it in the practical way of a woman not given to sentimentality but not immune to it either. Margaret was a quieter child than Thomas, with Catherine's precise manner of observing the world and Abraham's patience, and she was reading before she was 4, which Catherine discovered one morning when she found her daughter in the schoolroom working her way through a primer with the concentrated attention of a person who takes reading very seriously. By the fall of 1883, the Lockhart Ranch had expanded to 120 acres, incorporating Catherine's original 50 into a combined operation that was managed jointly, with clear documentation of what belonged to whom because Catherine had insisted on this from the beginning, and Abraham had agreed without argument because it was obviously correct. The school had become something of a model, the county superintendent having visited twice and recommended its methods to other valley settlements, and Catherine had written 2 articles for the Santa Fe New Mexican about frontier education that had generated correspondence from teachers in Arizona Territory and Colorado. Frank Mendez came to supper in October of 1883, the 5th anniversary of Catherine's arrival in the valley, and he brought his wife and they made an evening of it, all of them on the porch in the cooling fall air with coffee, and a pie that Dolor's had sent with Catherine for the occasion. Frank gave a toast, as he had at the wedding, and this one was about persistence, about the specific quality of people who find a valley and decide it is theirs and refuse all evidence to the contrary. Catherine looked at Abraham across the table, and he raised his cup to her slightly, the smallest possible gesture, and she raised hers back, and between them was everything that the valley had made of them. The 5 years of mornings and arguments and shared work and the rain on the porch and the books in the same room and the children sleeping inside, and the gate that had kept bringing her back, every road leading here, to this, to him. To the life that had been building itself all along out of determination and geography, and the particular stubbornness of 2 people who, when they found something real, did not let it go. Pete Hargrove had told her once, in the offhand way of a man who has lived in a place long enough to have opinions about it, that the valley chose its people. He meant it as folk wisdom about who stayed and who left. She had thought about it a great deal since then. She was not sure she believed in valleys choosing, in fate or inevitability or roads with opinions. She believed in choices made by people who knew themselves well enough to make them honestly. But she also believed that the roads in the western part of the valley had a particular curve, a geological specificity that funneled travel toward the low basin where a ranch sat with its iron gate and its cottonwoods, and that she had walked those roads in a dozen different directions and arrived at the same place, and that when she arrived the man at the gate had always been someone she was choosing, even when she didn't know she was choosing, even when she told herself she was simply understanding the terrain. The terrain of Abraham Lockhart she had understood by now completely, and it was hers and she was his, and the gate was always open. In the spring of 1884, Thomas Lockhart, age 3½ and already showing the particular combination of his parents' qualities that made his teacher mother look at him with the professional recognition of a child, who was going to be either exceptional or exhausting and probably both, discovered the lever mechanism of the gate latch and began opening it himself. He was found on 3 consecutive mornings at the gate, working the latch with the satisfied expression of someone who has mastered a system. Abraham found him there on the 4th morning, sitting on the bottom rail the way his father sat on the top rail, looking out at the valley road with an air of proprietary calm. Abraham sat down on the rail beside him. They looked at the valley together in the early light. Thomas said, with the perfect gravity of a small child making a large observation, "Everyone comes back to our gate." Abraham looked at his son. Then he looked at the road that curved through the sage toward the south, and he thought of Catherine on that road, the first time and the fourth time and every time, and he thought of 5 years and 2 children and 30 students and the particular quality of a September morning, when she had said yes to him with conditions and meant both parts equally. "Yes," he said, "they do." He picked Thomas up and carried him back up the path to the house where Catherine was making coffee, and the valley was going gold in the morning light, and Margaret was just beginning to wake, and the gate was open behind them, and the roads curved the way roads always had in this valley, back toward the center, back toward the thing that had been there all along, patient and real and waiting to be chosen. Catherine was standing on the porch when they came up, Thomas on his father's shoulder looking enormously pleased with himself, and she looked at them both, her son and her husband, in the morning light of a New Mexico spring, and the look on her face was the same one Abraham had been wearing since the first time he saw her digging that ditch, the one that neither of them had needed to name, the one that was simply what it looked like when a person has found the place they belong and knows it, and is not afraid of knowing it and intends to stay. She held out her arms for Thomas. He came to her with the easy trust of a well-loved child. Abraham climbed the porch steps and stood beside her, and they looked out at the valley together, the amber cliffs and the silver sage and the river threading through it and the road beyond the gate curving its particular curve. And the morning kept coming, and the gate stood open, and the valley held them all.